that?
It's a Bradley.
Well, if that's the Bradley, then what's this?
What's the date?
1968. The question is, how did they get to that from this?
Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the movie The Pentagon Wars and how the Bradley and its development process went from something of an internet meme to, well, this. And it turns out it's actually a little bit more complicated than most people realize, and some of the points brought up in the movie The Pentagon Wars actually do have some legitimate merit, but some of them are also a little superfluous and don't really make a lot of sense. So join me as we do this little review of this old movie. And I do want to start off by giving at least a passing mention that a lot of Western IFV designs, and you can see this reflected in the Bradley, were influenced by the BMP being adopted to most Soviet mechanized infantry formations. And for those that aren't aware, most Soviet infantry formations are mechanized. So the BMP was available in a lot of their units, and with both a cannon and an anti-tank missile, the BMP did feature significantly more firepower than just something like M113s with 50 cals. And this did in turn influence Western designs, because if you didn't have something to match that, you would be at a disadvantage on a company-to-company level.
Gentlemen, our mission was to design and implement an infantry transport vehicle that would be a worthy replacement for the M113 armored personnel carrier. We have met that objective and then some. The Bradley armored personnel carrier will bring troops to a combat zone swiftly, efficiently, and safely. It will hold 11 men, plus a driver, and features a 20mm cannon, which will provide ample firepower and at the same time flexibility. Lightly armored, speedy, and solidly engineered, our troops will be arriving at the battlefield in the very finest American technology has to offer. And at $1.5 million per, a real bargain.
Now, the opening of the Pentagon Wars tries to frame the Bradley as though it was originally supposed to be a very simple and straightforward replacement for the M113 armored personnel carrier. As far as I can tell, that is a reasonably accurate assessment. However, there are a few oddities. Number one, it calls out having a 20mm, where I was only able to find references to the original version supposed to have a 50 cal. It does call out an 11-man squad, which is not typical, but there's also probably a reason for that we'll go into later when we start talking about carrying capacity. And one thing that is notable is that the individual that kind of wrote the Pentagon Wars and is essentially the star of this was a bit of part of the reformer movement, which seek to make everything very simple, and they thought complexity was bad. They were the part of the group that thought the Abrams and the Bradley and the Apache would all fail in Desert Storm, and obviously that didn't happen. So it's important to take some of these statements about the vehicle getting overly complicated with a bit of a grain of salt in that area.
Well, this is all well and good, Colonel Smith, but...
Something wrong, General?
Well, with this gorilla in production, I don't suppose there's going to be anything left in the budget for my Scout.
Doubt it, Bob. You don't need scouts. You have radar, air recon, satellites.
You always need a Scout. And you know what I'm thinking? Why couldn't this thing serve as a Scout?
But it's a troop carrier, General.
But this is a speedy vehicle. Why can't it be both?
Well, for one thing, it's too big. And for the other, you can't really see out all that much from inside.
Sounds like a design flaw to me.
Design flaw? No.
No, we'll just stick a turret on top with lots of opticals.
But then, sir, it'll be even bigger.
Now this is where we get to our first interesting part of the video. This is wherein the Cav Scouts want a dedicated vehicle, but obviously know there won't be much of a budget for it with the Bradley in production, so they decide to co-op the Bradley. Obviously this is where you get the M2 IFV and the M3 CFV variants. However, one of the more interesting parts of this is that the individual notes that the M3 Bradley is going to be very conspicuous for a scout vehicle. Do you want to guess the scout vehicle that was in use at the time? It was the M113. Actually, more specifically, the scout section at the time, at least the reconnaissance version, was an M113 paired with an M901. And additionally, the Cav troops would have M60 tanks in support. So the idea that a Bradley would be big and conspicuous for the scouting role is actually a little ridiculous, given the vehicles that were already in service and the fact that the Abrams was slated to go into these formations as a replacement for the M60. In fact, up to Desert Storm and even the initial part of Operation Iraqi Freedom, the standard cavalry troop consisted of M1 Abrams and M3 Bradleys. And it's important to note that US cavalry is kind of an odd bird, because most cavalry formations, when horses went the way of the dodo, essentially either converted into a normal armored formation, or they converted into a normal scout formation. The American cavalry kind of did a little bit of both. The American Armored Cavalry regiments, such as 2nd and 3rd ACR, converted into a role eventually where you would have both heavy armor firepower and you would also have the ability to do reconnaissance at the same time, and that's why you have this very heavily armored force doing essentially reconnaissance duty. Now they do have lighter vehicles, Jeeps and then later Humvees, to conduct more discreet reconnaissance, and they also have dismounts for setting up LPOPs for more further forward than you could get with, say, an armored vehicle. But it's important to realize that a lot of the cavalry mission in the United States Army actually does involve a lot of direct combat action where you need a vehicle that has good armor and firepower, where something like the Bradley is much better suited than the older model M113s.
And how about some portholes along the side for individual firearms so the fellas can stick out their guns and shoot people?
I'm glad the Pentagon Wars points out one of the more absurd and hilarious parts of the Bradley development, and this is the M231 port firing weapon. Now, firing ports weren't that uncommon at the time because there was a concept of fighting in an irradiated wasteland, and while doing that, you don't necessarily want your troops to get out, so you want them to be able to shoot from inside the vehicle, which is why you see so many firing ports on vehicles at the time, including the original BMP-1. So this one crazy general is actually reflective of a general military establishment in the time that has this thought process. However, this ended up not really panning out because the firing ports have very poor visibility, so you can't even see anything, much less hit it. However, when developing the firing port specifically for the Bradley, they actually developed a specific weapon, the M231 port firing weapon, which is definitely not an M16. It's more like a closed bolt machine gun with an absurdly high rate of fire. I'm not really sure why they decided to go with this instead of just having some way to slot in the soldiers' M16s. But yeah, like if you look at the service numbers ordered for the M231, it is 5 M231s per Bradley, because you have 2 on each side and then you have 1 in the back door. And the idea, at least from what I've been told, is that you're supposed to load all tracers in them and fire extremely fast and try to walk your rounds at a target. But it still used 30 round M16 magazines, so you would basically run out of ammo before you could do that. It just wasn't a very effective idea, and I have never seen any good rationale as to why they didn't just have the soldiers use their normal M16s for this. Interestingly enough, when all of the up-armored kits came out, one of the first things to go was the firing ports. They were deleted from basically all Bradley's M2A2 model and forward, except for the rear firing port on the back door. The Bradley that I was specifically riding in at one point had one on the back door, and I was not a Bradley crew member and I was not an infantryman, so I didn't know what it was. So when I asked the crew member, he said, before you get out of the vehicle, you can just spray a bunch of bullets out the back. And this didn't sound reasonable at the time, and it doesn't now. The only reason I can really come up with is because it actually had a way to screw into the firing port, so in theory it would create a better MDC seal than like poking your personal weapon out, but that's about the best I could really come up with. It is just kind of a weird and dumb idea that didn't pan out at all.
We already have the turret. We ought to get the biggest bang we can up there.
I'm sorry, bang, sir?
You can't hurt anybody with that pansy-ass gun. Add on some firepower.
Where am I supposed to fit the extra ammo?
I don't know. Can't you just shift things around? Make some room.
You already got 4,400 rounds of machine gun ammo. Now you want to add 25mm shells.
General wants his ammo.
You can't have his ammo, not unless he runs alongside this thing carrying it.
Well, can't you just squeeze it in?
No.
Oh, come on, just squeeze it in.
We're not trying on Levi's here, Colonel.
Are you telling me that in a vehicle this size you can't find room for a few rounds of ammunition?
Not in its current configuration, no, sir.
So the configuration's wrong.
There must be something you can dump.
Dump, sir?
Something you don't need.
General, the interior is very spare. Besides the ammunition and the men...
Maybe you can leave one of the fellows behind. Put the ammo where the men go.
Sir, it is a troop carrier.
So, make a couple extra trips. What's the difference?
Now this clip actually has a few things going on, but it does hit on a very important point, and that is design compromises. It's very difficult in an armored vehicle that has a confined space to add something without also having to remove something else, or compromise another way by making the vehicle physically larger and heavier and needing more powerful engines and suspensions and things like that. You don't simply add things onto a vehicle, it's simply not how it works. Now, with the 25mm cannon, there is a valid reason for it, and we already kind of discussed it with the BMP. It was rational to believe at the time that American mechanized infantry formations would need a bigger gun than like something like a 50 cal. So there was a rationale to it. It wasn't just out of nowhere, but it also does, of course, mean you have to make a compromise somewhere else. And this is where you get to the infantry carrying capacity, which we kind of have to discuss as its own separate topic because the Bradley is kind of interesting in that regard. So this is where I get to use at least some of the knowledge I got from the NCO Academy to give everybody a bit of a crash course on US Army infantry squads, or at least the preferred configuration and the way it's been for around the last 50 years or so. A standard US Army infantry squad is 9 personnel. You have 1 squad leader, you have 2 teams, and each team has its own team leader, grenadier, and machine gunner. The reason the US Army likes this squad configuration is because the squad has 2 elements, so you can have a fire element and a maneuver element. On top of that, it's not so large that it's unwieldy, but it's not so small that it can't absorb casualties. So the US Army likes this as its preferred squad size, even though things like combat losses or other circumstances can force you to adjust around a bit. Now, depending on the specific variant of the Bradley, the troop carrying capacity, the dismounts, has either been between 6 and 7 personnel with 3 vehicle crew members. As you can tell, this is not a full 9-man squad. Now, the way the US Army has previously solved this issue is they essentially Tetris your 3 squads across 4 Bradleys, with the squads kind of split up, and then you have the platoon leader and the platoon sergeant kind of riding in a vehicle together. And this is kind of an odd configuration because it makes dismounting the vehicles a little awkward. It's not unusable, but it does require more administrative work than if the vehicle had a full capacity where you could just do 1 track per squad. Now, the reason why they mentioned 11 earlier in the video was not because the squad size was 11, but it's because if you have an armored personnel carrier, you don't have the additional firepower of an IFV. So in that situation, you would want a weapons section that have things like anti-tank weapons, heavy machine guns. But obviously, if you had the Bradleys themselves providing that additional firepower, you don't really need that weapons section. So you can just run a little lighter and just go with the 3 basic squads without necessarily needing a weapons section. You also see this in Soviet bloc in the BTR motorized formations versus the BMP mechanized formations. The BTRs have dedicated anti-tank missile teams with their own BTR because the BTRs themselves don't have ATGMs, whereas because the BMPs do have anti-tank guided missiles, they exclude that entirely and they don't really need that additional section. So that is one of the advantages of an IFV over like an APC, is you don't necessarily need that extra weapon section to provide additional heavy weapons because you already have them in the form of the vehicle itself. Now, not too long ago, the Army did publish an alternate formation for the Bradley mech infantry companies in which you would have 6 Bradleys per platoon that would basically be their own separate unit, and this would leave you with 2 tracks per squad. So this means you wouldn't have to split your squad up across multiple tracks, and it also had enough room for a weapons section with some additional M240 machine guns. While it's a nice configuration, it does show that the Army is still trying to work around that core problem of the Bradley not quite having the carrying capacity that they really want it to. And it is more complex than simply having 1 vehicle per squad, as a lot of militaries tend to do.
That's a problem.
Why?
You go out in a battlefield with this pecker sticking out of your turret, and the enemy's gonna unload on you with all they got. Might as well paint a big red bullseye on the side.
But it's a troop carrier, not a tank.
Do you want me to put a sign on it in 50 languages? I'm a troop carrier, not a tank. Please don't shoot at me.
So I don't really understand how somebody who was a US Army officer would think this to be a valid criticism. Anything that is flagged as hostile and has hostile combatants on board, whether it be a tank, an IFV, or even a motorcycle, is probably getting shot at, as long as it doesn't have a red cross on the side. So I'm not really sure where they were going with this, or why they thought it sounded intelligent, but it's actually just kind of dumb when you think about it in any real context.
Besides, portholes? What are we in now, the Navy? Say, you think you could make this thing amphibious? You know, get the troops across a river?
No. No, sir. No. No.
Amphibious? The Bradley's supposed to swim?
In theory, at least.
In theory being the operative term. The original version of the M2 Bradley did have a trim vane on the front of the vehicle that could be extended out and a flotation skirt that ran along the sides. This could technically be used for amphibious operation, however it was kind of impractical, so it never really got used. In fact, it was so unfavorable that the Army essentially deleted it. In all of the up-armored versions, the additional armor packages both deleted the trim vane on the front and removed the flotation skirts along the sides. So the Army, you could say, is a little soured on the idea of amphibious vehicles, because in practice, unless your entire force is amphibious, it's not that useful of a capability. You can just control the other side of the water obstacle by fires instead of having to physically occupy that territory while the engineers construct a bridge, and you'll probably need the bridge anyway.
Aluminum. This thing's got an aluminum skin.
Huh?
Anything an enemy tank fires at is gonna go through it like a hot knife through butter.
Yeah, citation needed on that one. But it turns out when you are an infantry fighting vehicle and you have to have a large cavity in the middle to carry infantry, this means that your vehicle is going to be incredibly heavy if you put a lot of armor on it. And while the Bradley, as we've seen in Ukraine, is pretty well protected for an IFV, it is still ultimately an IFV. It's unrealistic to expect it to survive direct hits from a tank.
Thicker armor's a reactive measure. Let's think proactive here. I say equip the thing with anti-tank missiles. Then it can blast those enemy tanks before they get a chance to fire. What do you think, Colonel?
Fine. Anti-tank missiles?
I don't know.
Where do I put them? The men will have to wear the missiles as hats.
So we already discussed this earlier, but it turns out if you need a capability, simply not including it kind of isn't an option, as with BTR mechanized formations or light infantry formations where they have to have separate sections with anti-tank missiles specifically to deal with that threat. Even if you took the missiles off the Bradleys, the platoons would still need those missiles somewhere. So while it is a valid criticism that missiles can take up a lot of space and a lot of weight on a vehicle, it's also important to note that you're not necessarily saving that much by not including them on the vehicle.
It carries 6 men.
How many was it supposed to carry?
11.
Bradley is outfitted with the most sophisticated surveillance equipment ever developed. It is also equipped with a rapid-fire cannon and an anti-tank rocket launcher.
Which means it's loaded with
1,500 shells and 10-tow anti-tank missiles.
So in summation, gentlemen, what you have before you is
a troop transport that can't carry troops, a reconnaissance vehicle that's too conspicuous to do reconnaissance,
And a quasi-tank that has less armor than a snowblower, but has enough ammo to take out half of DC.
Now, the Pentagon Wars is amazing for anybody who's ever been trapped in a room full of brass that have a bunch of bright ideas that they can't be dissuaded from, and all you can really do is smile and nod and hope they realize it's a bad idea, or get bored before you have to implement anything, and for that I think the movie is amazing. As far as factual accuracy, it's not too far off, and several of the dumb ideas it points out did in fact end up being dumb ideas that were removed from the vehicle later. However, a lot of the conclusions it draws seem kind of unusual and are definitely coming from a reformer mindset where any technology or anything new or different is viewed as strange or wrong and will just fail under combat circumstances, which obviously didn't really pan out for the reformers at all. The closest thing we've ever had to a situation in which troops could compare multiple Western and Soviet IFVs together in essentially the same combat environment is the current conflict in Ukraine, and it definitely says something about the Bradley that in a sea of other IFVs, some of which are cobbled together and some of which are allegedly the best in the world, the Bradley has so far managed to stand out as being one of the strongest offerings, offering a good combination of protection and firepower for its crews. And I think that says something, because you can look at all of the stats of a vehicle on paper day in and day out, and ultimately when it comes down to brass tacks, the fightability of a vehicle involves a lot of other factors that can't necessarily be compared directly. And that concludes our video. If anybody was a Bradley crew member, feel free to drop some personal experiences with the vehicle in the comments down below. I know a lot of the vehicle crews I talked to really enjoyed their time with the vehicle, but I didn't personally have that much time with it. But anyway, I hope you liked the video, hope you learned something. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, that always helps out the channel. And as always, don't give it to shoes.